A very warm welcome to everyone, particularly to Andreas Kettis for accepting our invitation to the second guest lecture of the EU POP Jean Monnet module. We are particularly pleased that this guest lecture is going to go a little bit beyond the field of law into the realm of politics or law and politics. Distinguished guests and participants, colleagues and students, on behalf of the School of Law UK Cyprus and the EU POP team, let me welcome you. It's a real pleasure to be here together this afternoon, despite technical difficulties, to this second guest lecture, EU POP guest lecture, whereby we will invite everyone to think together, to reflect together on a very fundamental societal issue, which is the one of tackling populism in Europe, with particular emphasis on the role of the European Parliament when faced with the threat of populism. I'm particularly pleased to welcome our guest speaker, Mr. Andreas Kettis, because as you will see from his rich CV, we are very honored to have him with us, but also because he represents an EU institution which perhaps is less known to the lawyers. So the lawyers are usually very familiar with the Court of Justice of the European Union, but perhaps less familiar with the work of the European Parliament. So that gives us a chance to pass a few simple but clear messages about the work of the European Parliament and the importance of the European Parliament. So thank you, Andreas, for your willingness to be with us today and speaking with us. Thank you to the participants to the guest lecture, as well as to colleagues who are behind the scene, Andrea, Andreas, Kostas, and the others who've been helping with the organization of this guest lecture. And it's a pleasure to have in the audience a mixture of students, colleagues, experts, academics, but also lawyers and the wider public. So before I start, let me remind you that this guest lecture is recorded. Probably you have seen the slide which Andrea displayed. We record events because the idea is to widely disseminate for educational purposes the work of EU POP and the interventions by guest speakers. So please keep your cameras and micros off at all times and feel free to use the chat function to communicate with us. Can I please remind you, and it's very important for today, that each speaker and other participants take part in an educational setting to this guest lecture, and therefore whatever they will say or provide verbally, electronically, otherwise must not be accepted or interpreted as either legal advice or any form of advice. So you may view materials that is at your disposal in the Microsoft Teams classroom, which you are free to take away with you from the guest lecture, but please use with the necessary acknowledgements. So let me, in a nutshell, introduce our guest lecturer today, our guest speaker, Mr. Andreas Kettis, and then say a few words about the role of the European Parliament and why it matters. So Andreas holds a university degree in political science and public administration with specialization in public international law and international relations from the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens in 1999. He pursued postgraduate studies in the UK with a merit scholarship from the government of the UK. He holds a Master of Arts in Contemporary European Studies from the Sussex European Institute of the University of Sussex at Brighton from 2001. He was a career diplomat between 2001 and 2016. So Andreas joined the diplomatic corps as soon as he graduated from his master program. That's very interesting for us. During this time, he served as deputy director of the Office of the Permanent Secretary, then deputy chief of mission at the Embassy of Cyprus in Sweden, with parallel accreditation to Norway, Iceland, Latvia, and Lithuania. Then went on to diplomatic counselor at the permanent representation of Cyprus to the EU in Brussels for quite a few years. Then went on as deputy director of the Middle East department at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Nicosia, and senior official of Cyprus to the Union for the Mediterranean, again of much interest to us here. He then went on as a chief diplomatic advisor on EU affairs to the President of the Republic of Cyprus and Sherpa of the President of the Republic for the European Council meetings during the Cyprus presidency of the Council of the EU, which was back in 2011 to 2013. Yeah. No, yeah, the presidency was 2012.
The second semester, right?
Second half, was it, or first half?
Second half.
Second half of 2012, but you held that very interesting position from 2011-2013. At some point over coffee, Andreas, you will have to explain to me the meaning of Sherpa in this context, but this is for a separate discussion. Then was seconded national expert in the DG Expo of the European Parliament until 2014. Senior diplomatic counselor at the permanent representation of Cyprus to the EU in Brussels. And in September 2015, you decided to leave the diplomatic corps of the Republic of Cyprus. You succeeded in European competition. Well done, and good example for other young people who are with us today. And you were appointed head of unit in DG Com in the European Parliament, and you were posted in Nicosia as the head of the Office of the European Parliament in Cyprus. So very well done for all this. This is perhaps there would be questions to you, Andreas, as to your career path and how could students basically embrace this career path. But let me say a few words about the European Parliament, which through the evolution of the role of the European Parliament, one can really grasp the evolution of the European project and why it matters today. So the role of the European Parliament lies at the foundations of the European project and of the broader construction of the EU constitutional legal order through the development of the protection of fundamental rights and freedoms in the European Union. So indeed, the constitutionalization of the EU legal order differentiates itself from other international legal orders or treaties, as we can see from this very basic and very fundamental case, which actually involved the European Parliament, which is the case of Parti Écologiste Les Verts versus European Parliament. Case 294/93, which the students of EU law must at all costs study, but also the students of fundamental rights and human rights. In this case, the Court of Justice of the European Union spoke of the EEC, the then EEC, and the European Economic Community Treaty, as a basic constitutional charter and outlined the importance of the European Parliament. Professor Weiler argued with respect to this case that the treaties have been constitutionalized and the community has become an entity whose closest structural model is no longer an international organization, but a denser yet non-unitary polity, principally the federal state. Put differently, the community's operating system is no longer governed by general principles of public international law, but by a specified interstate governmental structure defined by constitutional charter and constitutional principles. This is a quote that anyone who wants to work or study and work with the European Union should be aware of. This comes from the Transformation of Europe, which is a very famous article by Professor Joseph Weiler of 1991 in the Yale Law Journal. Now, what he's describing as the EU moving away from the international legal order into its own legal order is quite obvious if one takes the Bosphorus jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights, the Bosphorus Airways versus Ireland case of the Strasbourg Court, not the Luxembourg Court this time, of 2006. In this case, the Strasbourg Court basically introduced the European Convention on Human Rights as an instrument of European public order into the EU constitutional legal order to be applied in the event of a manifestly deficient protection of fundamental rights in the European Union. Unlike the postmodern EU constitutional legal order, however, the ECHR, the Convention, remains a multilateral treaty in the realm of international law. On their side, on our side, the European Union and its member states have proved, following the Bosphorus jurisprudence, that the protection afforded to human rights in the EU is equivalent to the one afforded to human rights under the ECHR, including through the legislation of the European Parliament and the case law of the Court of Justice of the European Union. This is yet one more step into the constitutionalization process of the EU legal order away from international law. The role of the European Parliament has deepened throughout the amending treaties the amending EU treaties, with a major reform post-Lisbon. A democratic and transparent Europe requires the upholding of the rule of law through a strengthened role for the European Parliament, which is a directly elected body by EU citizens, to give the EU citizens a stronger voice with wide decision-making powers. And all this is very important and has been enhanced following the Treaty of Lisbon. Else, the European Parliament will not be able to combat phenomena like populism at the EU level and help national parliaments to combat such phenomena at the national level. A more efficient Europe requires effective decision-making and streamlined institutional framework and processes. A Europe of rights and values requires enshrined and applied democratic values, citizens' rights under the EU Charter, and an area of freedom, security, and solidarity for all, guaranteed by law through the European Parliament standing before the Court of Justice of the European Union, particularly, and through various mechanisms such as the triggering of Article 7 of the EU Treaty in the event of a clear risk of a breach of fundamental rights by a member state. Last but not least, the role of the European Parliament is also important for Europe as an actor on the global stage. Now you will ask me why. Well, if you think about the ongoing ratification process of the EU-UK Brexit deal currently before the European Parliament, I think we have an example on point. So I think I will stop there because probably that's more than enough for people to digest, and then we can come back to it during the discussion. Now I'm going to call on, I think we have Andrea next. Yes, Miss Andrea Manoli, who is an associate lecturer at UCLan Cyprus and also research fellow of the Jean Monnet module, EU POP, to give us a brief overview of the Jean Monnet module EU POP, past and future events and activities.
As Stephanie said, since this lecture is taking place within the framework of the Jean Monnet module entitled European Union Law and Governance in Populist Times, please allow me to provide with a project summary of this specific module. So the EU is faced with a threat to its very foundations through the rise of right-wing populist narratives and political parties in the form of inter alia Hungary and Poland. The current climate of uncertainty, migration flows, without adequate integration policies in many European countries, including Cyprus, and the rise of fake news, particularly online, constitutes a fertile setting for the rise of populists. The climate generated by such phenomena are damaging in themselves and also in their manifestation, such as in relation to the protection of the rule of law and human rights. So this module is established on research-informed teaching of the soft and hard tools available at an EU level to challenge the populist threat and its manifestation in the form of deterioration of the rule of law or risk thereto, hate speech, including online hate speech, hate crime, aggressive Euroscepticism, which is currently tainting Europe at the local, national, and regional level. To this end, the module was developed on the premise that there exists an urgent need to develop research in the area which continues to remain underdeveloped, to enhance teaching excellence in the field, so as to ensure that young professionals and graduates are well equipped with the ability to understand the regulatory framework in the EU, and to foster a coherent dialogue between stakeholders, civil society, and academics on the chosen theme, and to offer a core output to the Commission eventually on guidelines for improvement of the current regulatory framework. During the project, we will host 3 experts. We've hosted Dr. Ulat Pelavusau from the Asser Institute and the University of Amsterdam last year. Today, we're hosting Mr. Andreas Kettis, who will speak on the European Parliament actions in tackling populism. And next year, we will host Professor Dimitri Kochnov as well. The knowledge and skills developed by the teaching team and the general expertise developed in the framework of the project culminated the development and publication of the first peer review journal on populism. In files, you will also find the call for papers for the journal. Furthermore, intensive summer schools will run through the lifetime of the project, which is open not only to students, but also stakeholders, policymakers, and the wider public. An open educational platform of information on the project and all the outputs of the project, such as recording of guest lecture, videos, guidelines, a link to the online journal, and to the working paper series was created. The working paper series will allow researchers and students who are benefiting from the module to be able to publish their work. And the platform will bring together the material and outputs of the project, which will also raise visibility on the Jean Monnet program. During the first trimester of the project, a digitalized bibliography was prepared, aiming at enhancing awareness on available literature on populism and the law with a particular focus on the EU. The module also issues newsletters, 4 of which have been already published and can be found on social media as well. You can subscribe through our website to get these newsletters. Finally, the module will hold the final international conference of academics from Cyprus and beyond. The 3 experts who will be the keynote speakers will bring excellent academic and policy insight into the conference. And during that conference, selected papers and abstracts will be presented and published in a special journal series. On the 3rd day of the conference, there will be also a roundtable with academics, civil society, policymakers, and other relevant stakeholders for purposes of bridging gaps between academic outputs and the ground. The roundtable will result in a publication of guidelines and recommendations for policymakers, other relevant stakeholders, and the EU institutions on ameliorating the conduct and application of the EU toolkit on preventing and tackling the rise and effects of populism in the EU.
Thank you, Andrea. That sounds a lot for such a small project, so thank you very much for setting out everything we do. Maybe, Andrea, we could share the link of the project again in the chat. Now, let me call on another Andreas, this time Andreas Marcou, Dr. Andreas Marcou, colleague at the school as well, lecturer at the School of Law of Euclid, Cyprus, and a research fellow of the EU POP module, Jean Monnet module, for his input. So we discussed with Andreas, and we thought that his input would need to be perhaps more normative. So Andreas is going to give us a few insights into the populist threat and the tools of the European Union's disposal. Thank you, Andreas.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and many thanks to Mr. Kettis for delivering this talk today. I thought of delivering some remarks, a bit more general remarks about the concept of populism and the rise of populism in different countries across the European Union. And for the last part of my comments, I'd like to say a few things about the legal and the non-legal mechanisms that are at the European Union's disposal. When it comes to populism, there is much debate about how we can precisely conceptualize populism. In general, it is accepted that populism amounts to a kind of political discourse. In other words, it's a way of talking about politics. Populist discourses tend to imagine a society that is divided in two competing classes. On one hand, you have the ordinary people, and on the other hand, you have the elite. And within populist discourses, this distinction is always moralized. This means that the people are always good, they're always noble, uncorrupted, and on the other hand, the political elite are always corrupt, evil, constantly exploiting the ordinary people, and so forth. So populism inspires and feeds on the anger on the part of the ordinary people against a political elite that is seen as exploitative. Populism, however, does not amount to a robust substantive ideology. At best, populism is a thin ideology. This means that populism tends to emerge combined and associated with various other ideologies. So some of the most well-known populists, and I'm sure Mr. Kettis will probably have a mention of some of these figures, are of course Donald Trump, Nigel Farage in the UK, and Boris Johnson. And their way of talking about politics can be seen as entailing nativism as well. Nativism is the idea that national identity, in the case of the figures that I've described, American and English identity, is under constant threat from others, and therefore ought to be protected. It ought to be preserved. And this sort of right-wing nativist populism is often associated with racism and xenophobia. On the other hand, populism can take different forms. Back in 2010, 2011, there was a great movement that started out from the US, the Occupy Wall Street movement, and that movement took hold after the financial crisis. People allegedly representing the 99% engaged in demonstrations and civil disobedience against what they saw as a corrupt economic elite who managed to emerge from the financial crisis unscathed, right, passing on the burdens to ordinary people. And more locally in Greece, we had the rise of Syriza. Syriza followed a populist anti-EU rhetoric, at least up until it managed to get hold of political power in Greece. And Syriza's rhetoric, especially its early rhetoric, posited the EU and other international economic institutions as corrupt bodies who were oppressing and exploiting the Greek public. What these examples are meant to demonstrate is that populism can come in many shapes and forms. Sometimes populism can be inclusive, right, as was the case with the Occupy movement, asking for more political participation for ordinary people. At other times, populism can be exclusive, right, as was the case with Trump's nativist right-wing populism that saw immigrants, with particular attention to Mexicans and Muslims, forming frequent targets. It saw immigrants as a threat to American identity and the American way of life. Today, I'll say a bit more about the rise of populism in Europe over the last decade or so. And I'm going to use the examples of Hungary and Poland, which are the two countries in Europe that are probably the most often topics of discussion when it comes to populism, and with good cause, I would argue. These two countries, the populist regimes in these two countries, they do pose a threat to the European Union and to basic European values, such as democracy and the rule of law. Moving on, I'm going to talk a bit more about the different tools that the EU has at its disposal. But before doing that, it is worth considering how the EU values certain principles such as democracy, the rule of law, and human rights. These are deemed fundamental for the European Union. They are provided for by Article 2 of the Treaty on the European Union. And very often, bodies of the European Union and the court have recognized these values as being at the core of the European project. And it's no surprise that countries wishing to join the Union must, according to Article 49 of the Treaty on the EU, demonstrate sufficient respect for those values encapsulated in Article 2. So the European Union maintains external mechanisms that prevent entry from the Union if those values are not sufficiently safeguarded. But the question is, what happens when it is countries that are already part of the European Union that engage in actions that undermine fundamental values? And that is the case, I'm going to argue, with Hungary and Poland. In general, populism and populist rhetoric have a rather uncertain relationship with the rule of law. Within populist politics, a leader usually emerges as the person that embodies the will of the ordinary people. And that leader acts in ways that allegedly further the interests of the people, typically by tackling the elites. The question then is, how does this formulation affect principles of the rule of law? Well, one basic function of the rule of law is that it puts limits on the unmediated political power of agents, even when those agents purportedly act for a democratic majority. So the rule of law, which is linked with principles of constitutionalism, separation of powers, and judicial independence, becomes a way to limit potential abuses of a democratic majority. When a populist leader tries to act in ways that undermine the constitution, alleging that doing so represents the will of the people, the judiciary will typically stand against those actions. Judges tend to make decisions that limit the use of political power, and therefore within populist regimes, they're often accused of acting against the will of the people. You might remember the infamous front page in a British newspaper in the aftermath of the Miller case decision. And this is precisely why judicial independence is an irreplaceable component of the rule of law. Having an independent judiciary is necessary to hold political power into account. It is therefore no surprise that in countries like Poland and Hungary, government actions are primarily targeted at judicial independence, and they are primarily targeted at weakening the rule of law. And this is an attempt to maintain greater political power and stifle dissent. Perhaps the most common example used is a kind of legislation adopted by the Polish PIS party. PIS is the populist party in Poland. And the choice to lower the retirement age of judges from 70 to 65 years. The effect of that measure would be to force large numbers of the judges out of the bench. This would in turn provide the government with the opportunity to install new judges, presumably judges who would be more sympathetic to the government's populist agenda. Engaging in a practice of packing the court with judges sympathetic to its goals, the governing party undermines fundamental principles of the rule of law by attacking judicial independence. How can the judiciary provide adequate checks on the government if the judges are prejudiced and biased in favor of the populist party's agenda? Other steps adopted by the PIS in Poland have targeted the ability of judges to behave freely. For example, the Populist Party adopted measures to create a disciplinary court for judges who behave unethically. Judges who behave unethically are those who maintain a critical stance against the regime, those who are unwilling to help the regime push its own agenda. Despite multiple rule of law recommendations made by the Commission and the European Parliament, and the Populist Party in Poland has repeatedly ignored and openly dismissed those recommendations. The leader of PIS, Jarosław Kaczyński, insisted that there was nothing wrong going on in Poland that contravenes the rule of law. Since 2017, they has launched various infringement proceedings under Article 258 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU against Poland, and it has also initiated Article 7 of the Treaty on the European Union, often referred to as the nuclear option. Unfortunately, and I'll talk more about this mechanism in a bit, none of this has proved sufficient to improve the state of the rule of law in Poland. Briefly now turning to Hungary, Viktor Orban and his populist party of Fidesz gained power back in 2010. Since then, Orban has moved Hungary towards a direction often at odds with European values. In fact, Orban has explicitly defended a model of an illiberal democracy. Orban's populist party demonstrates elements of right-wing populism and employing populist ideology combined with nativist discourses. And so Orban's populism espouses xenophobic, racist, and exclusionary discourses against anyone who is deemed a threat to Hungarian identity. And such threats also include LGBTQ people. Hungary has taken many measures against LGBTQ minorities, including a refusal to recognize transgender people, legislation to proscribe the adoption for homosexual couples, and demand that gender studies be removed from university curricula. All of these are evidence of a sustained attack against individual rights that clearly infringes with European values. Given the actions of Hungary and Poland, and the way in which those actions undermine values such as the rule of law and human rights, one cannot help but wonder what the EU can do in terms of legal action. One avenue that I've already mentioned is the infringement proceedings under Article 258 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU. Both Hungary and Poland have been the subject of these proceedings on multiple occasions, right? So more than once. Yet there are certain difficulties when it comes to relying on Article 258. One difficulty is that traditionally the Commission has reserved this procedure for cases when member states fail to implement a directive or they incorrectly implement a directive. And the Commission has been hesitant to rely on Article 258 in order to bring actions against member states who engage in general breaches of EU law, including breaches of principles of the rule of law. In addition, and this is something that both Hungary and Poland have argued, what different countries understand as the rule of law varies. And therefore, it would be unfair if they are penalized because the Commission seeks to impose its own version of the rule of law. On those occasions when the Commission has launched infringement proceedings against Hungary and Poland in the area of the rule of law, it has done so with reference to other European values being violated. One example is bringing an infringement proceeding against the lowering of the age of judges. The Commission brought the action on the basis of age discrimination. The more robust procedure would be Article 7 of the Treaty on the European Union, because that procedure provides for much more severe punishment, including the reservation of political rights. The procedure was initiated, and we did have some hearings, but there was no substantive process being made. In addition, one major obstacle in reaching the sanctioning stage of Article 7 is that for discussion on sanctions to commence, there must be a unanimous decision by the European Council that there is indeed a serious and persistent breach of Article 2. The unanimity requirement would surely prevent the Article 7 procedure from reaching the sentencing stage, as both Hungary and Poland would stand firmly in support to one another. There are other tools available to the European Union, non-legal tools. We have different frameworks that on the rule of law that the European Union has relied on. Recently, we had some attempts to link the distribution of funds to protections for the rule of law. This measure would mean that countries violating the rule of law would receive reduced funding from the EU. Unsurprisingly, this measure was fiercely contested by Hungary and Poland, who incidentally were not alone on this. And even though the issue was temporarily resolved, we will have to wait and see how and if that measure would be effective. Overall, the rise of populism poses a significant risk for the European Union. In its manifestations in Poland and Hungary and elsewhere, populism can work to undermine the rule of law and violate fundamental rights. And Mr. Kettis' lecture today will hopefully help us see how a core EU institution, such as the European Parliament, can contribute to this fight against the rise of right-wing populism. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Andreas. And I think that Andreas Kettis can actually now take it from where you left it. So that's very interesting. I'm sure we can go back to some of what you discussed. Andreas, the floor is yours. I know you have slides.
Thank you very much, Professor, and many thanks to Andrea and Andreas Marcou. I think he has prepared the ground for my presentation. Actually, he said many things that I would like to point out, but this facilitates actually my presentation. So I suggest, Stephanie, if you can hear me, to watch together a very short video from a very well-known incident that took place when the former president of the European Council, Van Rompuy, appeared before the European Parliament to get the support of the plenary, and where the notorious Mr. Farage of the United Kingdom, then leader of the let's say the anti-EU forces within the European Parliament, attacked him in a very populistic way. So it's worth watching this video, and then we can move immediately to the slides and the presentation. So give me one moment to see how to share the video.
We were told that when we had a president, we'd see a giant global political figure, the man that would be the political leader for 500 million people, the man that would represent all of us on the world stage, the man whose job was so important that, of course, you're paid more than President Obama. Well, I'm afraid what we got was you. And I'm sorry, but after that performance earlier that you gave, and I don't want to be rude, but you know, really, you have the charisma of a damp rag and the appearance of a low-grade bank clerk. And the question that I want to ask, that we're all going to ask is, who are you? I'd never heard of you. Nobody in Europe had ever heard of you. I would like to ask you, President, who voted for you? And what mechanism? Oh, I know democracy is not popular with you lot. And what mechanism do the peoples of Europe have to remove you? Is this European democracy? Well, I sense I sense, though, that you're competent and capable and dangerous, and I have no doubt that it's your intention to be the quiet assassin of European democracy and of the European nation states. You appear to have a loathing for the very concept of the existence of nation states. Perhaps that's because you come from Belgium, which of course is pretty much a non-country. But since you took over, we've seen Greece reduced to nothing more than a protectorate. Sir, you have no legitimacy in this job at all, and I can say with confidence that I can speak on behalf of the majority of the British people in saying we don't know you, we don't want you, and the sooner you're put out to grass, the better.
Well, as you said, Mr. President, you wouldn't like to be rude, and I prefer to go ahead with this statement.
I'm very disappointed with you, President Buzek. It is not acceptable that in this Parliament, a group chairman not only criticises the President of the Council, but calls him a wet rag. I expect you, President, to call this person to order. It's not right that this man should be able to trample over the dignity of this House. And Joseph Dole, it's not just a case of getting or allowing the UK to leave the EU. It'd be better for Mr Farage to resign if the European Union and the European Parliament are such bad things in his eyes.
Thank you, President. Just as I have said to President Farage previously, 2 months ago, and today I repeat this, these type of addresses, which are character assassinations of individuals, are inadmissible in the European Parliament, and I spoke to Mr Farage about it, and I drew his attention to it. Mr Schulz, I'd like to say that this is how I work, and that's my way of going about it.
Is it personal statement?
At the end of the debate.
Bardzo proszę.
The floor is yours.
You may not like what I say, but just consider your behaviour. You, after the Irish people in a referendum voted no, said that our group had opened, by supporting the no vote, that we'd opened the door to fascism. You said that we had behaved as a group in the Parliament like Hitler and the Nazis in the Reichstag. We've been called by Danny Cohn-Bendit mentally weak. You know, it has to be, it can't be one way.
It is not personal statement. Mr. President Farage, it is not personal statement. I am very sorry, it was not personal statement. We must keep order and all the regulations of our Parliament. The next, Mr.
Well, again, a very big thank you to Professor Shaelou and all of you for attending this presentation, and thank you very much indeed. As I said before, Andreas Marcou presented the issue of populism in a very holistic way. Many things he said actually for part of my presentation, but I will try to skip the things that actually he analyzed so that we don't have an application of effort in a way. What is populism? Populism has been around for centuries, both as an ideology and political movement. The populism we see today is a descendant of a long line of ancestors. The first unmistakably populist movement in history appeared well over 2 centuries ago during the later stages of the French Revolution. Robespierre and the Jacobins led it, promising a reign of a virtue. Stemming from the Latin word populus, meaning people, It is generally defined as a political program or movement that champions or claims to champion the common person against the perceived elite or establishment. The ideology is used by both far-left and far-right groups. Here are some prominent examples of existing groups within Europe. The red circle contains the left, while the grayish-blue the right. And we can see here, of course, the French Front National, the Madame Le Pen's party in France, the Dutch Party for Freedom, for instance, or Lega in Italy, or in Germany, the Alternative for Deutschland, the Austrian FPÖ, and some more among them the Hungarian Fidesz Party that Andreas referred to, the Jobbik. And in the opposite, let's say, spectrum, we can see the Spanish Podemos. In Greece, our very close to us phenomenon of Syriza. In France, we see the movement La France Insoumise, and of course we have a movement in Slovakia. And now the Italian Five Stars movement is a particular case. They have seen many changes the last few months, and actually right now they are negotiating their accession to the Socialist and Democrats political group in the European Parliament. So in a way, like the Greek Syriza, they are transforming to becoming more or less a mainstream party of the center left. The ideology, of course, is used by left and far right groups. Here are some, as I said, prominent examples. And even though there are cases of populism on both political spectrums, the extreme right has proven to have greater strains on the established status quo of the European Union. Sentiments like anti-human rights, anti-immigration, racism, and xenophobic rhetoric, just to name a few, are used and most times championed by the far right, not by the far left. This goes greatly against the pillars of the fundamental rights the European Parliament stands by. But the question remains, why is the extreme right attractive to voters? Populist groups claim to be anti-elitist, anti-systemic, and seem relatable to people dissatisfied with not only politics, but also societal life in general. Thus, their strongest supporters are stigmatizing groups who face difficulties in finding a positive social identity. This is why neo-Nazis, white supremacists, anti-immigration supporters, etc., are avid followers of these groups, making the far right all the more dangerous. And I think this becomes very evident when we talk about a democratic system of governance as the one we have in the European Union. The European Parliament is an inclusive body with 705 members. Representation with populist agendas also exists, and we watched the video in the plenum of the European Parliament in Brussels. This diversity is one of the things that make the institution, the European Parliament, thrive. With different voices and opinions, the decisions taken by the European Parliament and discussed from numerous perspectives. Nevertheless, in order to keep the European body intact, all groups and members, regardless of their political or ideological orientation, must keep in line with the rules of procedure of the European Parliament. This is the fundamental point I would like to underline. They have to be in line. Of course, different approaches are there, and we, as the General Secretariat of the Parliament, were there to facilitate all political actors, the members of the Parliament, to express themselves, but within the lines that set the rules of procedures. So, if not respected, certain measures are used as penalty. And of course, Article 2 is the most fundamental stone of the EU treaty when it comes to the principles and values upon the European Union is founded. Everything done in the Union builds upon this and follows these principles of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights, including, of course, the rights of persons belonging to minorities. In the last decade, Europe has seen a significant growth in populist parties, especially with far-right groups gaining prominence and their supporters growing in size. It has become quite evident that these groups use the parliament to shape voter attitudes, pressure mainstream parties to adopt more xenophobic rhetoric, fragment the mainstream right, and obstruct parliamentary proceedings. And does not happen only within the European Parliament's context, but we have seen it as well in national politics. We see new parties of the extreme right coming up, be formed, and they exert this pressure on mainstream center-right parties. And we have seen certain center-right parties shifting towards more right-wing politics because of the pressure exerted on them by these extreme right-wing political formations. However, as mentioned before, the rules of procedure of the Parliament need to be abided, regardless of political orientation or ideology. If there is any instance where a member or political group does not respect the plenary rules, the response can be through warnings, and we have watched in the video. I dare to say, and don't quote me, a relatively weak president of the parliament, and you watched the reaction, the very strong reaction from the leader of the socialist group at that time, Martin Schulz, who later on became himself the president of the House. The role of the president is very important. He can warn against behaviors that go outside the remits and the limits of the rules of procedure. But besides warnings, there are also some other more severe measures that can be taken against populists who violate the rules of procedure. And we speak here about penalties, like, for instance, limit their access to payment and other allowances that the members of parliament are eligible. So if Article 2 is jeopardized, the European Parliament can respond by launching Article 7. Andreas raised before in his presentation the procedure with regard to Article 7. Article 7 actually can potentially suspend the rights of the member state in question, greatly limiting its ability to have power in any proceedings. But honestly, and from my experience, I can tell you that it is indeed very complex. It's a very complex process to that might lead to limiting, let's say, the rights, the voting rights of a member state in the end of this complex and very difficult process. But anyhow, the treaty, I think it's very important that we have this Article 7, because in my view, it's more important to have it as a kind of threat against any, let's say, thinking from the part of member states to go along with violating the principles and values upon the European Union is founded as described in Article 2 of the Treaty on the European Union. And it is very important to understand the current situation of the European Parliament in relation with EU populism. You are all aware that the pandemic has had an impact on all aspects of life. Everything went through an adjustment period to comply with COVID safety measures, including, of course, the European Parliament. Until new systems were put in place, our daily activities definitely took a minor toll. And especially when we pair all of this with a worsening economic climate, we see that the European Parliament's position becomes more vulnerable against right-wing politics. With the Union unable to make quick and effective decisions regarding budget, for instance, such right-wing populist groups grasp the opportunity and demagogically exploit, of course, the situation. In order to thwart this kind of rhetoric, I believe that the European Parliament would need to function better and learn to employ more efficient decision-making. Hopefully, by doing so, the European Parliament can reduce maneuver and gain for populist groups to promote their own agenda. Now, as I mentioned in the one of the previous slides, we will look at some examples of populism in relation with the European Parliament. The first one focusing on how the European Parliament can react in response to actions that jeopardize Article 2. And let's take at this point the Fidesz party case, the party of the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orban. Viktor Orban entered the European Parliament circle right after the election for his second term of presidency. From the start, he was criticized for undermining press freedom and attracted the EPP's attention. The EPP is the largest political family, political group in the European Parliament, for those who are not familiar with the political groups in the European Parliament. And EPP stands for European People's Party. So Orban attracted the EPP's attention with his hard anti-immigration views, particularly that. Of course, other groups in the European Parliament reacted very strongly as well with other issues beside, immigration, such as Orban's vision to uphold, let's say, a genuine population, Christian population in Hungary. And as you know, you are all lawyers in this group. The European Union has nothing to do with Christianity. Nowhere in the treaties of the European Union says that the European Union is a group or a group of countries or a club, a Christian club. But that's all. Often referring to his vision as illiberal democracy and Christian democracy, Orban inflicted countless blows over the years. He targeted civil society groups, reigned in the media, and held elections that were criticized by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, and even refused to respect EU asylum rules. All of these actions had repercussive warnings, which were voiced during plenary by other MEPs, members of the European Parliament, groups, and of course, the President. However, The eventual ending to this build-up came about in 2019 when the Hungarian government targeted one of the EPP's most prominent politicians, then Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker. The Hungarian government published a poster campaign on their social media platforms with unflattering pictures of Juncker and George Soros and fake news about Brussels migration plans. For many in the EPP group, criticizing Juncker in this fashion was a step too far, and they agreed on Orban's suspension. Indeed, the EPP has extended the suspension of Hungary's ruling Fidesz party indefinitely, but we have also latest developments on this saga. Since, if I'm not wrong, 3 weeks ago, the Fidesz party left the EPP before it is officially expelled. So now the Fidesz party of Hungary does not belong to the European People's Party. Another example we can look at is Brexit. In 2016, the result of the British referendum initiated the long and bumpy process of the United Kingdom's exit from the European Union. This referendum outcome is heralded as one of the most visible examples of the growing strength of right-wing populism in the world. It must be stressed that Euroscepticism was very present in the United Kingdom and Conservative Party in particular, long before the recent increase in support for right-wing populist parties in Europe as a whole. However, populism and anti-immigrant sentiment, the core features of right-wing populism, specifically UKIP, have played the leading role in bolstering Brexit and to where we find ourselves today with a union sans the United Kingdom. And what about the future? I am aware that things can change overnight and nothing can be predicted. Nevertheless, I think this is a very important question to ask, to have some notion of where we might be heading. This year, we also bid farewell to Trump. With the Trump chapter closed, the Biden era has brought about great fear for the populists across Europe. Why would American politics have such an effect on the right wings of the European Union? The answer is the Trump paradigm. Trumpism has become already a notion in international politics, in international relations. So Trumpism has become an iron pillar in the ideology of European populist parties. And we have the examples of America First, echoed as Hungary First, France First, Italy First, Netherlands First, etc. It was such an extent that Trump's chief strategist, Steve Bannon, was missioned in Europe, stationed in northern Italy in Milan, in order to successfully attempt to coordinate an alliance between the leading right-wing parties of Europe. And we saw him, Steve Bannon, working to connect all the ultra-right-wing parties before the European Parliament's elections in May 2019. And again, on this saga, we have a latest development. I was reading the other day in Financial Times that Steve Bannon actually submitted a request to the Ministry of the Interior of the Italian Republic, requesting to use an old medieval monastery in the surroundings of Milan in order to set up a political academy for all the right-wings, ultra-right-wing parties of the European Union. Of course, this request was turned down by the Italian government. The results of the 2019 European Parliament elections signified a hopeful start for the dwindling of extreme right-wing powers in Europe. And now these once US-backed right-wing groups are now faced with the harsh reality of having lost a very rich and supportive best friend, a loss which also quells the agenda to unite all populist powers of Europe. Some would see this as a relief for democracy seekers in Europe. However, only time will tell what the future for populism and the European Parliament will be. After all, the next European Parliament elections are just around the corner. In 2.5 years, we have the next Parliament elections, the next European elections. Allow me to finish this presentation by quoting my president, the president of the European Parliament, David Sassoli. And I quote, "We are going through a complex and dangerous period. We live in times in which potential threats to democracy have grown disproportionately. The response lies in continually renewing ourselves, focusing on citizens' participation. No one can consider themselves immune, not even the European Union. Freedom must be defended from manipulation and disinformation. We must always remember that democracy is a fragile system." Thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you good luck in all your future endeavors, especially to the students. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andreas, for those, well, first of all, for very insightful presentation, but second, also for those very nice cartoons and other satires. I have to say I enjoy this immensely. And this is something which you find quite often in Brussels, actually, or even in Paris, you know, that offices of politicians or of EU officials are filled with such drawings. And it is such a good way to disseminate information.
Exactly. I strongly share this this argument, Stephanie. I strongly believe that cartoons, political satire, is part of politics. Is a kind of narrative of politics, and it plays a huge role. We've seen what happened in Charlie Hebdo in Paris, and with other cartoons in Denmark. But let's focus on our topic today, on populism. And I'm very, I mean, you're fans. You will coordinate any questions that we might get from the participants.
Thank you, Andreas. I think it was a very interesting analysis of what the European Parliament can do and what actually is happening at the level of the European Parliament. I'm not sure that, you know, this is so well known or widely well known in the public, how the European Parliament not only can use tools available and mechanisms available, but can also use, you know, diplomacy and the techniques of diplomacy and international relations to try to, you know, counter even within its own group. So this is very interesting, a very interesting insight for lawyers. Now,
but if I may something, if I add to this, Stephanie, in times of crisis, the ground for populist movements, especially the neo-Nazi movements, ultra right-wing movements, anti-migration movements, becomes more and more fertile. And this is why, especially because in the European Union, we have been facing crisis after crisis since 2008. We had the beginning with the Lehman Brothers crisis in the United States that actually followed suit the crisis in the Eurozone, the problems Greece faced particularly at that time, but also other member states of the European Union. Then we had the 2015 migratory flows and the pressures we felt in Europe from migration, another big identity crisis in the European Union. We saw member states sealing off their borders against the treaty, against the Schengen rules, without showing any kind of solidarity. And after that, of course, we have been facing now an unprecedented pandemic crisis in the health sector, showing again and once more how fragile our democracies are, how fragile our union is. Because when we face this kind of crisis, and you see links of the union cracking, this tells a lot about the institutional and fundamental repairs that we have to bring to the system, to the whole European Union. And this gives me the opportunity to champion a bit what the French President Emmanuel Macron has been arguing for some time now, that it is about time, more than 10 years after the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty, to start thinking about modernizing, updating certain elements of the treaties, and why not amending, if it is necessary, some elements of the treaty. And I think the upcoming conference on the future of Europe that is going to be kicked off in April, but officially on the 9th of May, on Europe's Day, hopefully in Strasbourg, but it will depend on the pandemic situation in France, will be a first-class opportunity, in my view, where citizens, stakeholders, academics, all of us will be having the right, through an electronic platform that the European Commission has set up and the Parliament is championing, where everyone will be able to say his or her suggestion about the future of the European Union. And I would like to encourage you, Stephanie, to prepare your students, because the future of Europe actually is about the youth, it's about the younger generations. They will live mostly with this new Europe that will emerge after the Conference on the Future of Europe finalizes its let's say, conclusions, and we will see whether a new intergovernmental conference will be called in order to have the treaty changes. It's a very interesting, from the, I dare to say, constitutional point of view with regard to the European Union. It's very institutional, and it's very important as well to encourage the citizens to have a say over the future of the European Union, because the European Union, at the end of the day, it's all of us. The EU is first and foremost the citizens of the Union. Again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Andreas. That of course raises many questions. I'm sure that there are questions in I can think of, Andreas or other people, but let me just perhaps continue on this theme, the theme of the in times of crisis, because actually this is what we're interested in here. This EU POP Jean Monnet module is the continuation of another Jean Monnet module which we had immediately following the bail-in in Cyprus. So basically from 2014 to 2017, we had another Jean Monnet module that was called FECOGOV. And it actually was looking at the implications of the financial crisis on citizens. So, and it is the finalization of the work under that Jean Monnet module that brought the need to look at this Jean Monnet module, the EU POP one, which is on the manifestations of populism or rather, which is to look at EU law and the European Union in populist times. So a specific type of crisis. But I think the way you just described the immediate future of the European Union is very interesting because it resonates with the work we have been doing as academics and with the findings we've had. So it has transpired that since at the very least the financial crisis, which as you indicated correctly started in 2008, if you think about it, it coincided with the Treaty of Lisbon in a sense. So it is no coincidence that the European Union evolved in the way it did, partly because of the financial crisis, but also because of the Treaty of Lisbon. So in other words, hadn't we had key changes made in the Treaty of Lisbon, particularly with respect to monetary and economic policies, we would not have been able to cope with the financial crisis. Not that it was easy to cope with the financial crisis. Of course, the European Union and its institutions have been criticized quite a lot at the national level. But at the very least, there was a clear understanding that we needed to move forward. And thank God the Treaty of Lisbon occurred before that movement forward. Now, the same way you mentioned the migration crisis, and the migration crisis is a very unfortunate example of a lack of movement forward. However, COVID, so the recent COVID-19 crisis actually shows quite well how institutions can work with each other and with the member states to try to actually move forward in the absence of all necessary rules, because of course treaties cannot plan every single crisis. It's not possible. And we see this with the financial crisis, with the migration crisis, or with COVID or public health crisis. The problem with this is that you can extend the frontiers, if you want. You can extend the rules of the treaties up to a point. So there cannot be a European integration project going one way with EU treaties and a parallel blueprint, which is at the moment what we have. Some areas of European law and European policy have moved on. So the financial crisis is a very good example, but also public health is another example. Whereas some other areas of EU policy have not moved on. So I'm thinking in particular about social policies, social cohesion. And of course, the biggest impact of all those crises is around societal issues such as social cohesion, unemployment, social policies, and migration. So those, and youth.
It's important, Stephanie, to see now, because the Portuguese presidency is planning to hold an EU social summit in Lisbon in May. And remember, some years ago, the Swedish presidency held one in Gothenburg, the first ever European Union social summit, exactly to tackle the question you have just raised. And I strongly believe that if we cannot go back and find again our course of action regarding the unique European social model we enjoyed in the 80s and 90s, I think the future of the Union is not bright at all. We have followed very strict fiscal policies the last 15 years, and this, in my view, from the using the political, let's say, my political mind, tells me that this is the real question that the leaders of the European Union have to tackle: how to give citizens the added value of the unique European social model. I know that we have many difficulties in Europe. We have issues with the monetary union. We have issues with the banking union. You know that the banking union has not actually been constructed in its full, let's say, dimension. There is the third step of the banking union, which is still missing, and I'm talking about the guarantee, the guarantee of the deposits, because it's one thing talking about the depositors in Germany, because the German state can, of course, guarantee the 100,000 of the deposits of each German citizen and depositor. And another thing, to talk about the bankrupted states of the south of Europe and their inability to guarantee and make this kind of guarantee. So if we talk about a monetary union, we have to talk as well about the third leg of the banking union. And this is something that the leaders have to proceed quickly, restore confidence, because this will be fundamental for the future of the union, to restore the confidence of citizens in the European Union.
So, thank you, Andreas. I think this is the right point to make the transition to go back to populism. So now that we have brushed the wider picture and we have, clearly said that there are unfinished projects or unfinished plans, the third pillar of the European Banking Union is one example. More striking for people is, of course, the social policy pillar, social pillar of the European Union. This is, and again, it has to do with financial issues. This is the main reason why. It has to do with the purse of the state. But this is where the ground for populism is very fertile, and this is where, of course, the European Union, preferably with the support of the member states, the full support of the member states, should work towards a new or a refreshed blueprint of European integration. Where is it that we want to go, and why is it that we want to go there? Now, I will give the floor to Andreas Marcou. But I just
if I add something, an element here, Stephanie, before giving the floor to Andreas Marcou, technology is, in my view, is not our ally in this effort, because we have been facing huge issues regarding fake news and disinformation. And believe me, we try our best in the Parliament and in the European Commission to tackle issues regarding propaganda from well-organized extreme right-wing centers, but also from third countries that target the cohesion of the European Union by providing and feeding up in the internet with fake news and disinformation. This is another element that it has to be taken into account.
Thank you, Andreas. Actually, this morning I was participating to a roundtable at the Academy of European Law in Trier, and the topic was AI and liability. And we spoke extensively about manipulation, the power of AI systems over states and over communication campaigns. Again, the European Union is in a good position to make a difference, and the European Parliament's role in the regulation of technologies must be noted. So again, this is an area where the European Parliament must be strong and must push the European Commission in particular, but also the member states, for stronger regulation. This morning we spoke about a right to a right not to be manipulated. Of course, this is not new, but also a right to disclosure of identification. Who is hiding behind all those AI systems, all those platforms? So the right to know who is the actual, we call it front-end operators and back-end operators. But I wanted to go back, and I see that Sojos has his hand up. I wanted to go back on probably what is the biggest threat of populism in this context. okay, hopefully we will have, an impetus for a new IGC, a new intergovernmental conference, and potential revisions of treaties, like President Macron suggested it. The biggest issue, and those of you who are old enough to remember the failure of the Constitutional Treaty in 2005, the biggest issue or the biggest obstacle, it's ourselves, actually. It's the member states and it's their representatives, our representatives. So with so much populism within the European Union, expressed the way you have described it, or Andreas has framed it, there is a real risk that any good opportunity for a new IGC and revised treaty provisions would be blocked by those countries who actually are represented by populist regimes. So it's like a catch-22. And this is one of the reasons why the European Union appears to be going in every direction. In what sense? In the sense that it's building right and left of the castle as it can. So the European Banking Union is a good example of this, and not only the European Banking Union. The ESM Treaty is a good example of building not really within the castle, but outside of the architecture. Artificial intelligence is a good example as well, because of course there the phenomenon is global, so it doesn't really matter if we speak to ourselves. We need to be able to be active on the international scene. And social policy is quite often the poor child of the story. So I think this is the main challenge, and this is a challenge for the European Parliament mainly, to be able to present views and represent citizens, because clearly the interest of the citizens and the protection of citizens comes through the social agenda. Now, I was wondering whether Andreas Marcou would like to say something, or whether I jump to Sozos first.
I have some things I'd like to say, but I think we can first hear from Sozos or other people if they have something to ask or say. Yeah. And then if there's no one else, I can make my comments. So it's fine if you want to go with Sozos.
Thank you, Andreas. I see nothing in the chat, but Sozos has raised his hand. So Sozos, you're very welcome to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Well, to be honest, my question doesn't follow your immediate discussion. So I'm afraid I'm going to take the discussion somewhere else. If Andreas would like to comment on what you have immediately said right now, then I can follow after Andreas, but it's as you like, huh?
No, I think so. You can go ahead, and then later on I can bring the discussion back to populism if it kind of transgresses. So it's fine if you'd like to go.
Okay, thank you. So I just put my hand down. So the presentation of Andreas Kettis this time was a very good one, and I also enjoyed it. It's true that it made me think of my student years with the canard enchaîné that we used to study almost, I would say. My question would go back to his presentation of political parties, and I was quite glad actually to see in such a presentation parties also of the far left. I think we're usually very easily drawn into saying that this is a problem of the far right, but it's not exactly presented in a proper way. So far left is also there, and actually this shows that the problem is the extreme, actually. So extreme people on both sides can cause this problem of populism. And my first question, actually, it's one question, but it has two parts. So the first part of the question would be, since we have seen political parties on a national level, how would Andreas comment on the existence of the Pirate Party in the European Parliament, for example? We know that these parties, pirate parties, exist also, especially in Scandinavia on a national level. But this is a problem, I would say, of the EU Parliament. And then the second question would be, how would Andreas see a kind of populism also emerging from parties within the normal spectrum, let's say, so towards the center, that pick on right or left extreme ideas just to pass on their proper positions, or perhaps just to say something which is the contrary to another position, and always the goal would be to attract the masses. So that would be another question to ask to ourselves, whether the center also would have some problems within this field. Thank you.
May I respond to the points raised by
Yeah, sure.
Well, with regard to the Pirate Party MEPs, so they are very quiet. They don't mess up in the parliament. Of course, they form part of the let's say the anti-EU political groups in the parliament. In the previous term we had two. In this term we have just one. But you know, I think there was a very important element is that they were greatly disappointed with the results of the European Parliament election of 2019. I don't know how many of you remembered that all opinion polls before the elections, 6 months before the elections, were telling that maybe 1/3 of the parliament would be more or less anti-EU Euroscepticists, or as we call them in the European Parliament Secretariat, Europhobics. But the elections turned the other way around, and we have very clear pro-EU majorities in the European Parliament right now. So we don't face any kind of, let's say, danger from inside the European. Now, with regard to the second, it's very interesting. Populist parties of the center. Honestly, I have thought about it. But the real question would be, are there any populist voices even in mainstream parties of the center left and center right? So those, we can have a dialogue.
Well, that is the basis of the question, actually, where people just hide behind or under, maybe we can say, the umbrellas of those normal parties just to express their populist ideas, yeah.
I think they are. And as I said in the presentation, particularly, and we have noticed, we have seen that, especially with center-right parties, the Christian Democrats in Europe, feeling the pressure from the populists of the extreme right, they have shifted themselves, and we have very solid examples. For instance, in Greece, with New Democracy Party, we have seen very, let's say, extreme politicians joining the governing party in Greece. Some of them are even ministers in the cabinet right now. And I think you can understand to whom I refer to. People who have played with a xenophobic, racist agenda in the past, but now they make form of the cabinet in Greece and in other member states as well. So populism, maybe populism is popular in European politics right now because of all the issues that Stephanie touched upon in her intervention. The lack of social cohesion, the economic difficulties felt by many populations in Europe right now. I think this creates a dangerous mixture that can exploit at some point, unless the European Union and the leaders. I mean, I think we have to close the gap of leadership first and foremost in Europe. We need this. to have again leaders that will go on the front line, explain the situation to people, and gain the confidence, like once more, of the people to the European Union policies. Make the case that together we can overcome better and more efficiently the current crisis, instead of going alone, or instead of following the advice of these extremists of both edges of the political spectrum. And I agree with Sozo on that, both of the extreme right and the extreme left. But honestly, in my view, I consider the extreme right-wing forces much more dangerous than the extreme leftist forces, simply because, at least in the European Union, we don't feel a threat from the extreme right-wing forces for the time being, at least.
Thank you, Andreas. Now, we have only 8 minutes left, and there is one question in the chat which is quite interesting. So I was thinking whether perhaps we could give the final words to anything that Andreas Marcou and Andrea Manoli would like to add. But let me read the question in the chat so that you can incorporate it, and then Andreas Kettis will give you the final words. The question in the chat says, what are your views on populism rising from the bottom up, meaning from the citizens? The person is referring to citizen initiatives around Europe, like the recent Swiss citizen initiative initiated referendum on the banning of the burqa. So we're not referring to the European initiatives, you know, the European Citizens Initiative here. We're referring to, you know, movements, whether they are loose movements or not. So until Andreas Kettis thinks about it, Andreas Marcou, do you want to make some remarks on what Sozos asked, and then on this question, and anything as we discussed previously?
Yes, so I have a few points down that I'd like to mention. The first one is in regards to the video that that Mr. Kettis had us view, and his later comment on procedures on the European Parliament. And I do understand that procedures are immensely relevant and important every time we're talking about any sort of decision-making body, right? Procedures are there for a reason. But I think it's worth noting, worth remembering how these procedures are portrayed by populist parties. Because for populist parties, those procedures are not seen as fair rules to regulate debate. They are instead seen as elitist limits on our speech. And I think that was very evident in the speech by Nigel Farage, because that's exactly how he spoke, right? There's, of course, procedures about decorum and the way to speak and things to say. And Nigel Farage deliberately broke those rules precisely because they would invoke a reaction, as they did, right? And therefore, Nigel Farage would go viral. Everybody would be watching his video saying, this person is trying to speak and they don't like what he's saying, right? So I think it bears having in mind how these rules that may look procedural and morally unimportant, right? How long to speak, what to say, when's your turn, how those rules can turn into something that is used by populist parties and populist politicians. There's a second point that I'd like to make in relation to Sozos' point about the extreme right and the extreme left. As Mr. Kettis very correctly pointed out, the danger at the moment is primarily the far right wing, the far right populist party, precisely because their agenda is more explicitly anti-European, it's more explicitly racist, more explicitly xenophobic. Whereas far left-wing parties, as we've seen with the example of Syriza, they tend, at least because there's a limited pool of examples that we can use, Syriza would be an example, Podemos would be another. Both of them, they kind of limited their anti-EU rhetoric at different stages of their political career. And then one final point, I don't want to take a lot of time in response to this question. I think it's extremely interesting. It bears remembering that populism is supposed to be bottoms up. It's supposed to come from the bottom and be a wave that sweeps away the political elites. Is that how it happens in practice? Not always. Right? So typically what you will have is a group of politicians that will take advantage of a grassroots movement. They will take advantage of a sort of popular feeling and therefore build on that feeling. But the truth is that populist ideology comes from the bottom. So it's not at all surprising that in a time of crisis, whatever that crisis might be, feelings of xenophobia and racism tend to proliferate, and therefore they tend to take a hold on ordinary people, on everyday people, who essentially they get someone to blame for whatever is plaguing their lives. And so what populist politicians do is essentially they point to the target and they direct that hate there. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to say these few things.
Thank you, Andreas. This is so interesting and so well said that there is little to add. Andrea Manoli just texted me that she has issues with her micro, so she cannot talk. Andreas, yes, Kettis.
Thank you so much. If I can have the final word in thanking you and Andreas and Andrea, and allow me to reply to the question raised last, and very much agree with what so nicely and rightly said by Andreas Marcou. Just one thing to add on that: the populist politicians are clever politicians. And they are there ready to test the waters. They see what the sentiments are there in the grassroots. So if there is a sentiment against Muslim migrants, they are there to exploit immediately the situation and flare it up. And this is what makes populism and extreme, and especially extreme right-wing populism so dangerous, because extreme right-wing populism is about violation of human rights, fundamental violation of human rights, like the freedom to exercise your religion or the freedom of speech. They are xenophobic, etc. Whereas the extreme left-wing parties, and we have seen this in the European context, the extreme right-wing parties want to distract the European Union, to destroy the European Union, because their baseline is the nation state, is nationalism. And I want to repeat what François Mitterrand said once: le nationalisme, c'est la guerre. Nationalism is the war. And the European Union was set up exactly to put an end to wars in Europe and to put an end, in the end, to nationalisms in Europe, because we are building up joint institutions. The sovereign member states are pulling sovereignty towards these common supranational institutions like the European Commission and the European Parliament. These are the greatest supranational institutions of the European Union. Whereas on the other hand side, the extreme left-wing parties are anti-EU as well, but their narrative is that we want another Europe. They do not claim to or argue to destroy Europe, but another Europe, social Europe. Okay, and this is the main difference, which is very important in my view. And with this, I would like once more to thank you all very much indeed for this opportunity to engage into a dialogue with you.
Thank you so much, Andreas Kettis, Andreas Marcou, Andrea Manoli, and all the participants and all the attendees for being with us. Sozos has put a nice comment in the chat if you want to read it before going away. It's been a pleasure. I think this kind of discussion is extremely helpful, very important for the young generation, but not only, for all of us to put things into perspective, to be able to cross-check information, ideas, views at different levels. And we have been very lucky that for once, our guest of honor was not a lawyer. I mean, was rather, someone from the political sphere, because that allows us to frame things differently, to articulate arguments differently. And this is very important.
I'm a political scientist, Stephanie.
Exactly, political scientist. So, of course, it's very, very close to law. But the way the argumentation is put forward is very different, and so it's a very important exercise for young people and experts to be able to use different disciplines and build their argumentation, not just one discipline. Yes. So we thank you so much for your time, spending 2 hours with us, Andreas. And we look forward to more when the time comes. In the meantime, good luck with what you have to do at the European Parliament level. We are following. Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Bye.